They scrutinized her ID, questioned her legitimacy, and called security, all before realizing they were about to deny service to the one person who could end their careers in a heartbeat. The idea had been sitting in the back of her mind for months. A quiet thought at first, easy to push aside. But the more she reflected on it, the more it gnawed, refusing to be ignored. Evelyn Carter had built Carter Financial Trust from the ground up, her bank, her legacy. She wasn't just a CEO sitting in a glass office, detached from reality, issuing decisions from a distance. She had spent years ensuring her institution was different, accessible, and built on fairness, but was it really? That was the question that kept her up at night. The doubt that lingered no matter how many policies were in place. Whispers had reached her before, concerns about how certain customers were treated at certain branches. Nothing blatant, nothing that made headlines, just a feeling. Stories from friends, comments in passing from people she trusted, remarks that she had brushed off at first. After all, her bank had strict policies on fair treatment, anti-discrimination, and customer service excellence, words that looked good on paper. But policies were just that, words, empty and meaningless if not upheld by action. Evelyn needed proof, needed to see it for herself, not as a CEO, not as a boss, but as a customer. So today, she wasn't Evelyn Carter, the CEO of Carter Financial Trust. Today, she was just another woman walking into a bank. No designer heels, no expensive blazer, no name tag that made people stand at attention. Just a simple cardigan, jeans, and sneakers blending into the background like any other person. She pulled into the parking lot of a Carter Financial branch in Indianapolis, Indiana, a location she had personally greenlit 3 years ago. She had shaken hands with the branch manager, cut the ribbon, and given a speech about trust being the foundation of good banking. Now, she was walking in as a nobody, no cameras, no grand speeches, just an ordinary customer with an ordinary request. The automatic door slid open, and the familiar scent of freshly printed money and industrial strength air freshener filled the air. The lobby was quiet, only a few customers stood in line, and a teller at the far end was balancing a cash drawer. Evelyn adjusted her bag on her shoulder and stepped up to the counter, her expression neutral but observant. The teller, a young woman in her mid-20s, pale complexion, dark hair pulled into a stiff ponytail, barely glanced up. No greeting, no smile, just a quick once-over before shifting her attention back to her screen. Evelyn cleared her throat, her voice calm but firm. "Hi, I'd like to make a withdrawal." The teller didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the request with even the smallest courtesy. Instead, she reached for a clipboard and slid it across the counter in a mechanical motion. "Fill this out," she said, the words clipped, devoid of warmth or professionalism. Evelyn's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing, taking the form without argument. It was a standard form: name, account number, withdrawal amount, nothing unusual or unexpected. She pulled a pen from her bag and carefully filled in the details, her hand steady. $5,000. Not an enormous sum, but enough to require ID verification under normal procedures. She slid the clipboard back, expecting the usual routine: ID check, verification, then transaction completion. But that's when the shift happened. The teller's eyes flicked over the form, then to Evelyn's ID, her brows pulling together slightly. A hesitation settled in, something almost imperceptible but undeniable, a beat too long between glances. Evelyn had seen that look before, not directed at her, but she knew it well. The teller's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then as if coming to a decision, she slowly placed Evelyn's IDAC on the counter instead of proceeding. I'll be right back," she mumbled, barely meeting Evelyn's eyes before snatching up the ID and disappearing into the back office. Evelyn exhaled slowly, tapping her nails against the marble countertop, watching the teller disappear behind the frosted glass door. She had expected to be treated differently, but she hadn't expected this. She glanced around the lobby, quietly observing, noting the interactions happening around her. A man in a wrinkled business suit stood 2 spots behind her. His tie loosened. His posture exhausted, he looked like he had come straight from work. When he stepped up earlier, the teller greeted him immediately. No clipboard, no hesitation, just polite efficiency. Another woman, older, wearing a floral dress, was chatting easily with a different teller, laughing, her transaction proceeding without delay. No hesitations, no extra steps, no scrutiny, just smooth, effortless service. Evelyn turned back to the counter, her jaw tightening, aware of the stark contrast in treatment. She had been standing there for 5 minutes now, waiting for something that shouldn't even be happening. The atmosphere in the lobby had subtly shifted, the air thickening with something unspoken, something simmering beneath the surface. Finally, the frosted glass door swung open, and the teller emerged with someone else. A man, middle-aged, stocky build, bald with rimless glasses, his name tag reading James Albright, branch manager. His expression was polite but calculated, too controlled, the kind of look Evelyn had seen in boardrooms where decisions were made behind closed doors. James wasn't here to help, James was here to assess. He stopped at the counter, offering a stiff smile. "Afternoon, Mom. I understand you're trying to make a withdrawal." Evelyn nodded once, her voice steady. "That's right, $5,000. My account, my ID." James glanced at the teller, then back at Evelyn, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Mind if I take a quick look at your identification?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Evelyn exhaled through her nose. "I already gave it to her." James didn't acknowledge the comment, didn't offer an apology, simply picked up the ID and held it up to the light, studying it like it might reveal some hidden secret. Then, without even looking at her, he asked, "Miss Carter, is this your first time banking with us?" Her stomach dropped, not from nerves, but from recognition. She knew exactly what he was asking, understood the subtext disguised beneath the professional veneer. The question was so carefully phrased, yet the meaning was painfully clear. "Do you belong here?" Her tone sharpened. "I've banked here since this branch opened." James gave a slow, exaggerated nod as if processing the information like an interrogation rather than a standard banking request. "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000, he asked, as if it hadn't been written clearly on the form in front of him. Evelyn felt her patience thinning, pressing her lips together before responding, "That's what I wrote down." The lobby had gone quieter, not silent, but a noticeable hush settled in, the tension thickening. A few customers had glanced in her direction, sensing the shift in energy, eyes flickering between her and the branch manager. James turned the ID over in his fingers, stalling, dragging out the moment like it might change something. Then, in a too casual voice, he asked, "And what do you do for work, Miss Carter?" Evelyn let out a short laugh, not from amusement, but disbelief. There it was, the moment where the mask slipped, where professionalism cracked just enough to expose the truth beneath. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, then answered carefully, "I'm in finance." James's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes, a brief hesitation before he pressed further. "Oh, what kind?" he prodded, the false curiosity in his voice grating. Evelyn let the silence stretch just long enough before responding. "Banking," she said plainly. That made him pause just for a second before he doubled down. "I see," he said slowly. "And this is a personal account, correct? Not a business one." Evelyn folded her arms across her chest, her patience wearing thinner by the second. "That's what it says on the form," she responded, matching his measured tone. Another slow nod, another exchange of glances between James and the teller, more hesitation, and then James made his decision. He placed the ID back on the counter and said, "Unfortunately, we'll be able to process this withdrawal at this time." Evelyn blinked, processing the words before straightening. "What?" she asked, her voice edged with disbelief. James gave a calm, practiced expression, the kind meant to dismiss concerns without actually addressing them. "We're unable to verify the transaction," he said smoothly. Evelyn felt her pulse kick up, a slow burn of frustration rising in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice firm. James clasped his hands together and said the one word that confirmed everything she had suspected. "Security." Evelyn's fingers curled against the marble countertop, her patience wearing dangerously thin. This wasn't about security, and they both knew it. It wasn't about banking policies or fraud prevention. It was about something unspoken, something embedded in their assumptions about who she was and whether she belonged in a place like this. The tension in the room had thickened, stretching between them like an invisible wire, pulled taut, ready to snap. She steadied her breath, keeping her voice even, refusing to let her frustration bleed into her tone. "James," she said, her eyes locking onto his with measured control, "what exactly needs to be verified?" His hands remained clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable, too composed for someone who should be offering a simple explanation. "Large cash withdrawals require additional security steps," he said smoothly. "We just need to confirm a few details before proceeding." Evelyn arched a brow, already anticipating the next move. "Like what?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, daring him to take this further. James hesitated for a beat too long, just long enough for her to know he was thinking up a justification. "Just some basic account verification," he finally said, his voice still measured. "Can you tell me the last deposit amount made to this account?" Evelyn stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. That wasn't standard procedure, and they both knew its security questions were normal. But this wasn't one of them. not for a withdrawal with a valid ID. The question wasn't about verifying an account. It was about making her prove she belonged. I don't have that number memorized, she said evenly. But if you pull up my account like you would for anyone else, you can see all my deposits. James gave her a thin smile, the kind that barely concealed condescension. Of course, he said, but in the interest of security, we need to make sure the account holder can confirm certain details first. Evelyn let out a slow breath, forcing herself to remain steady, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing any frustration. I just gave you my ID, she reminded him, her voice holding the weight of quiet authority. James didn't flinch. I understand, he said, still holding on to his carefully rehearsed calm, but you'd be surprised how often fraudulent IDs come through. Evelyn inhaled through her nose, her patience fraying at the edges. I'm not withdrawing millions, she said, her voice carrying just enough bite. It's $5,000, a fraction of what I have in this account. I've already followed protocol, so let me ask again, what's the real issue here? James's expression remained neutral, too practiced, too careful. We're just doing our due diligence, Miss Carter. The words landed like a dismissal, a polite way of telling her she wasn't getting what she came for, and suddenly Evelyn knew exactly how this was going to play out. James had already decided she wasn't supposed to be here, and nothing she said was going to change that. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, preparing to push back when James made the mistake of taking things one step further. He reached beneath the counter, pressing a discreet button near the register. A silent alarm. Evelyn barely had time to react before a uniformed security guard stepped out from a back office, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His hand rested casually near his belt, not aggressive, but intentional. His expression was unreadable, but Evelyn knew what this looked like. A bank manager refusing to process a customer's request was one thing, but calling over security, that was something else entirely. A statement. An escalation. A power move. The security guard stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Is there a problem here? Evelyn turned to him, keeping her posture relaxed, refusing to give them an excuse to twist this narrative. That's what they wanted to paint her as, the problem, to make it look like she was the one causing trouble. That depends, she said coolly. Are you here to help me access my money, or just to escort me out? The guard hesitated, glancing between James and Evelyn, the weight of the moment pressing in on all sides. James exhaled through his nose, like he was the one being inconvenienced. Miss Carter, if you'd like to return with additional documentation, we'd be happy to assist you, but right now we can't. Evelyn cut him off before he could finish. You know what's funny, James? She asked, tilting her head slightly. I watched you process that man's transaction 10 minutes ago. No extra verification, no manager intervention, no security. The words landed, and for the first time, James hesitated. She took a step closer to the counter, her voice lowering just enough to make the point land. I wonder what's different about me. The teller shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the register, avoiding eye contact. The security guard adjusted his stance slightly, no longer as rigid, now unsure. But James held his ground. I'm sorry you feel that way, Miss Carter, he said, voice flat, rehearsed, dismissive. But our policies are in place for a reason. Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh. Is that right? James tilted his head slightly, like he was considering his next move, like he was still in control. Would you like to try using a different form of verification? He offered. Perhaps a utility bill, a second form of ID. A utility bill. Evelyn blinked, resisting the urge to let disbelief show on her face. You want me to provide a second form of ID for my own bank account? She said slowly. Where you're currently holding my money. James didn't blink, didn't waver. It's just policy, he repeated. Evelyn shook her head slightly, tapping her nails against the counter. Okay, let's do this another way. She leaned in just a little, keeping her voice even, but unmistakably firm. Pull up my account, James. He hesitated, and she knew why, because he knew exactly what he'd see. You have my name, she continued. You have my ID. If you check my file, you'll see that I've been banking here since day one, that I helped open this branch, that I probably signed off on some of your training materials. James's jaw tightened, his hands curling slightly into fists at his sides. You might want to check before you dig this hole any deeper. For the first time since this entire interaction started, James lost control of his expression. The confidence, the smooth indifference, it cracked just for a second. He shifted slightly, his tongue running over his bottom lip as he debated what to do next. Evelyn gave him 3 seconds to make a decision. 1, 2, 3. James let out a short breath, like he had reluctantly come to a decision. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," he said smoothly, "but without additional verification, we can't process this withdrawal today." A rush of heat flared in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from something sharper, anger. She could feel the eyes of customers nearby, subtle glances flicking toward the exchange, sensing the tension but pretending not to notice. She could hear the measured politeness in James's voice, the kind that let her know he wasn't concerned about security at all. He had already decided she wasn't supposed to be here, and nothing she said was going to change that. But James had just made one critical mistake, because if he had simply processed the transaction, this would have ended here. Now, she was going to make him regret it. And before she could even say another word, James did something that sealed his fate. He reached across the counter, snatched her ID off the marble surface, and held it up like he was the one with authority. That was it. That was the moment Evelyn smiled. Because James had no idea who he was dealing with. And in about 10 seconds, he was going to wish he had handled this differently. Evelyn tilted her phone slightly, ensuring the camera captured everything: the security guard, the teller, and most importantly, James Albright, branch manager of Carter Financial Trust, gripping her ID like it belonged to him. The tension in the bank lobby had reached its peak, a thick silence settling over the room as customers subtly turned their heads, pretending not to watch, yet hanging on to every second of the unfolding drama. James had no idea what he had just done. Evelyn let the moment stretch, her grip tightening around her phone, letting the weight of his mistake settle. Then, in the calmest voice possible, she said, "James, let me introduce myself properly." James's eyes flickered with uncertainty, his fingers curling around her ID just a little tighter. Evelyn reached forward, plucking it from his grip with deliberate ease, flipping it over in her hand, tapping a manicured nail against the embossed letters of her name. "You see this?" she asked, her voice too controlled, too measured. She let the pause linger just long enough for everyone to feel it. This isn't just any customer's ID. She took a single step back, her voice ringing out clear and sharp. "You are looking at the founder and CEO of Carter Financial Trust." The silence was instant, heavy, absolute. The security guard stiffened, his once firm stance faltering as realization hit him like a truck. The teller, her face drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Even the customers who had been subtly eavesdropping no longer pretended to mind their own business. But James, for the first time since this interaction started, James lost his footing. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his lips parting slightly as if forming a sentence, but no words came out. Evelyn let the moment sink in before slipping her ID back into her bag, adjusting her cardigan like she had all the time in the world. "I built this bank," she continued, her voice silky smooth but laced with steel. "From nothing. I signed the approval for this branch. I personally approved the hiring budget that got you this job." James's hands curled into fists, his face turning a shade paler, but he still didn't speak. Evelyn gave him a tight-lipped smile, one that carried no warmth, only cold calculation. "And today," she said, voice lowering just enough to make it intimate, dangerous, "I walked in as just another customer, just to see what would happen." She let her eyes flick to the security guard. "You were called over to escort me out," she stated, not asked, but stated. The guard hesitated before giving a slow nod. "Yes, Mom, that was my understanding." She nodded, absorbing the confirmation before asking, "And now that you know who I am, are you still under that impression?" The guard's eyes darted to James, uncertain, waiting for a cue. But James was frozen, his mouth opening and closing twice, before he finally found his voice. "Miss Carter, I sincerely apologize. This was just a misunderstanding." Evelyn arched a brow, her patience razor thin. "A misunderstanding?" He nodded quickly, his hands raised slightly, as if that could somehow undo the mess he had made. "Yes, absolutely, I can process that withdrawal right away," he rushed out, his words tumbling over themselves, desperate. Evelyn let that sit in the air, stretching the silence to the point of suffocation. Then, finally, she let out a soft laugh. "James," she said, shaking her head, "you and I both know it's too late for that." And James knew it too. His face had lost every ounce of confidence, the smooth, polished manager who had so casually dismissed her 5 minutes ago, now standing rigid, hands gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The security guard, who had been so ready to escort her out, now looked uncomfortable, unsure. And the teller, She looked like she wanted to disappear. Evelyn exhaled slowly, tapping her nails against the marble countertop. "Let me make sure I understand, James," she said, her voice measured, clipped. "Just a few minutes ago, my ID wasn't enough. My name wasn't enough. My account history wasn't enough. You needed more proof, more verification." She tilted her head slightly, watching him squirm. But now suddenly all of that doesn't matter anymore. James swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Miss Carter, I sincerely regret how this situation unfolded. I can assure you, this was not intentional." Evelyn let out a humorless laugh. "Not intentional," she echoed, amusement dripping from her voice. Then, her expression hardened. "James, do you think I'm stupid?" His eyes widened slightly, but he stayed silent. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she continued, her voice lowering just enough to sharpen the edges of her words. "You looked at me, and in your mind, you already decided I wasn't supposed to be here." James shook his head quickly. "Miss Carter, I assure you, that's not what happened." Evelyn held up a hand. "No," she said, her voice like steel. "You had your chance to speak. Now, you listen." The room was dead silent. She turned slightly, ensuring everyone in the lobby could hear her next words. "If I was standing here in a tailored suit," she said, slowly, letting every word land with weight. "If I were a man, if I looked like what you expect a CEO to look like, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation." James's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the security guard as if looking for help, but the guard said nothing. The teller. She was staring down at her register as if willing the floor to swallow her whole. Evelyn took a slow breath, pulling her phone back up. "James, I have a question for you," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Would you like me to send this footage directly to corporate, or should I just handle this right now?" James visibly paled. His mouth opened and closed twice before he finally managed a stammered response. "Miss Carter, I sincerely apologize." Evelyn arched a brow. "A misunderstanding." James nodded quickly, grasping at straws. "Yes, exactly. A complete misunderstanding." Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. "James," she said, her voice carrying the finality of a closing door, "you might want to start looking for a new job." James visibly stiffened, his shoulders locking in place. The teller inhaled sharply. The security guard glanced away, avoiding eye contact. Evelyn let the words settle, allowing him to feel the full weight of what he had done. Then, slipping her phone in her bag, she adjusted her cardigan, straightened her shoulders, and turned toward the exit. She didn't need to stay any longer. Her message had been delivered. But as she reached the glass doors, she paused, turning back one last time. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, unshakable. "This is the last time something like this happens in my bank." And then, without another word, she walked out. By the time Evelyn stepped out into the crisp Indianapolis air, she could already feel the weight of what had just happened settling in. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, adjusting the strap of her bag as she crossed the parking lot. Inside, James Albright was likely still frozen behind the counter, reeling from the consequences he had just sealed for himself. The security guard, who moments ago had been prepared to remove her, was probably still standing awkwardly, unsure of what he had just witnessed. She reached her car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. It would have been easy to drive away, to let the moment pass, to let James suffer in the silence of his own poor judgment. But this wasn't just about James, and it wasn't just about today. This was bigger than one bad manager making one bad decision. It was about an entire system that allowed it to happen. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and tapped a number. It rang twice before a voice picked up, smooth and professional. "Lydia, it's Evelyn," she said, her tone all business now. "I need an emergency meeting with senior leadership at headquarters tonight." There was a slight pause on the other end, but Lydia, her executive assistant, never questioned an urgent request. Of course, she responded immediately. "What's this about?" Evelyn glanced back at the bank through her rearview mirror, her jaw tightening. "An accountability issue," she said simply, "and it needs to be handled now." The large, glass-walled conference room at Carter Financial Trust headquarters had never been this silent. Seated at the long mahogany table were nearly a dozen high-ranking executives, each of them tense, their hands clasped in front of them. The weight of who was speaking and what she was about to say had settled over the room like an invisible storm. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, composed, controlled, but the steel in her voice made it clear this was not a discussion. This was a reckoning. "I walked into one of our branches last week," she began, her voice even measured. I wasn't there as the CEO. I wasn't there with a press team or a board of directors. I walked in as a regular customer and I was denied service. A ripple of shock moved through the room, though no one dared to interrupt. Evelyn let her gaze sweep across the faces in front of her, letting them absorb the gravity of what she was saying. Not because I lacked the correct ID, she continued. Not because I failed security checks, but because I didn't look like the kind of person they expected to have a high balance account. One of the senior VPs cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Carter, she lifted a hand, cutting him off before he could continue. No, she said, her voice sharp, leaving no room for debate. You're here to listen. The executive closed his mouth and sat back in his chair, his face unreadable. Evelyn continued, unshaken. This wasn't an isolated incident, she said. If this happened to me, I have no doubt it has happened to countless customers who don't have the power to call for an emergency meeting with senior leadership. She let her words sink in, the weight of truth settling into the bones of the room. She reached into a folder in front of her, pulled out a printed document, and slid it across the table. This, she said, is the new Accountability and Anti-Discrimination Initiative. It outlines a mandatory overhaul of our training programs, updated policies for identifying and eliminating bias, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination in any form. A few executives exchanged glances, uneasy, but no one dared to push back. Effective immediately, she continued, we will be conducting undercover audits in every branch, random evaluations where trained specialists will go in posing as customers. She tapped a manicured nail against the table, her tone sharp. If any employee fails to uphold our standards of fairness, they will be terminated on the spot. No exceptions, no second chances. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair and a decades-long tenure at the company, sighed heavily. Evelyn, we have policies in place already, she turned to him sharply, her eyes like ice. And what good are policies, she asked, if they are ignored the moment no one is watching? The man fell silent, realizing there was no defense. Evelyn folded her hands on the table, closing the discussion. James Albright has already been fired, she said. But that's not enough. She let her gaze move across the room, ensuring they understood. We fix this or we fail. And failure is not an option. The changes came faster than anyone expected. James Albright was gone, his position filled by an interim manager with a reputation for integrity. Employees across the company were retrained, not just on policy, but on actual accountability. Customers, especially those who had once been ignored, noticed the difference immediately. And as for Evelyn, she hadn't forgotten that day in the bank. She never would, because it wasn't just a moment of frustration. It was a reminder. A reminder that real change doesn't happen because of words on a page. It happens because someone refuses to accept the way things are. And that day, that someone was her. Evelyn stood by the window in her office, arms crossed, looking out over the city skyline. The sun was setting, streaking the sky with deep gold and crimson hues, bathing the towering buildings in a soft, fading glow. She had built this company from the ground up, believing in the promise of trust, fairness, and accessibility. And now she had made sure it would actually live up to those words. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up, reading a text from Lydia. Audit results from the first wave undercover evaluations. 93% compliance with new standards. Employees are more alert. Customers feel the difference. It's working. Evelyn allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She responded with a single line. Good. Let's keep going. Then, slipping her phone into her pocket, she turned away from the window. There was still work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, she knew she was building something that would truly last. The lesson from Evelyn Carter's story isn't just about a denied bank transaction, it's about the power of standing up when you know something isn't right. We live in a world where invisible biases can determine how people treat you. Injustice doesn't always come as loud, obvious acts. It hides in hesitant glances, baseless refusals, and obstacles others never have to face. The real question isn't whether you'll be challenged, it's how you respond when you are. Evelyn could have walked away in silence, but instead she chose to fight back. And because of that, not just her, but thousands of other customers will never have to face the same unfairness. That's the lesson for all of us. If you see something wrong, don't look away. If you know you're right, don't back down. Because change doesn't happen when we wait for it, it happens when we decide to make it.